When a judge spotted a royal guard wearing a cross necklace, he confronted him right there in public and ordered him to appear in court. But what looked like a straightforward case of breaking the rules turned into a courtroom surprise when the quiet guardsman revealed who he really was. Here's the story. Before we get started, please tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe if you respect the royal guards. The late morning sun made long shadows stretch across the courtyard at Buckingham Palace. Judge Lawrence Pembroke made his way through the crowds of tourists. Unlike the excited visitors shuffling about, Pembroke walked with the steady confidence of someone used to being in charge in a courtroom. His smart navy suit and silver-streaked hair made him stand out from the casually dressed people around him. "Remarkable," he murmured, glancing at his watch, a family heirloom from his father, who was also a judge. 200 years of tradition, and they still manage this level of precision. As someone who had spent his life upholding the law, Pembroke admired displays of order and discipline like this. The famous changing of the guard ceremony had just finished. The new guards stood at their posts, showing that incredible stillness that seemed almost unreal. "You see, this is what I keep telling my colleagues," he said out loud to nobody in particular, a habit from his job, even on his day off. "There's real value in keeping standards high, in holding on to the rituals that connect us as a society." Pembroke had always been proud of respecting tradition, even though he was known as one of London's more modern-thinking judges. His court decisions often made news for their fresh take on the law, which earned him both fans and critics. But here, in front of the palace, he was just like any other visitor admiring Britain's living history. His gaze followed the red-coated figure standing rigidly nearby. Something about this particular guard caught his eye. A small detail seemed wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Pembroke frowned slightly, his judge's mind automatically analyzing, trying to figure out what had snagged his attention. "Curious," he muttered, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. With the gut feeling that had helped him through thousands of court cases, Judge Pembroke sensed something wasn't right. And just like every case he'd ever overseen, he wouldn't stop until he knew exactly what it was. Pembroke walked around the palace grounds, pretending to look at the building, but keeping the guard in the corner of his eye. The soldier stood perfectly still, bearskin hat straight, red tunic spotless, white gloves clean. Still, something bothered the judge's experienced eye, the same eye that had spent years spotting tiny flaws in witness statements or contradictions in evidence. "Excuse me," he murmured, gently moving past a family taking photos. As he got closer to the guard, Pembroke looked more intensely. The morning light caught something shiny near the man's collar, something that didn't seem to belong on the ceremonial uniform. And then he saw it clearly. A small silver cross, partly visible at the guard's neck. It wasn't big or flashy, but it was definitely there, catching the sunlight with the tiny movements the guard made as he breathed. A religious symbol, Pembroke whispered to himself. A mix of feelings washed over him. Seeing the cross brought back memories he'd tried hard to keep separate. His father's strict Christian home, punishments justified with Bible verses, prayers that went unanswered when his mother was seriously ill. These memories had cemented his strong atheism, a belief he held as firmly as his legal opinions. His admiration for the guard's discipline suddenly clashed with a strong dislike for what he saw as an inappropriate show of personal faith. "This can't be allowed," he thought, his legal mind instantly remembering cases he'd handled about religious symbols in public roles. "The military has strict rules about uniforms. This is clearly breaking them." Unwanted memories flashed back, sitting by his mother's bed as she held her own cross, promising her that faith would make her better. The cancer took her anyway, leaving a 15-year-old Lawrence feeling angry at the God who hadn't saved her. Over the years, that anger had turned into a firm belief that influenced many of his most debated rulings. "How dare he!" Pembroke muttered, his earlier respect turning into anger, "to spoil this tradition with a personal religious statement." Having made up his mind, Judge Pembroke straightened his tie, something he often did before making a ruling, and walked purposefully towards the guard. "Excuse me, soldier," Judge Pembroke started, his voice carrying the same authority that could silence his courtroom instantly. He stood directly in front of the guard, hands clasped behind his back in his typical on-the-bench pose. The guard didn't move, eyes fixed forward, seemingly unaware of the confrontation starting right in front of him. "I'm talking to you, sir," Pembroke went on, his voice getting sharper. "That cross you are wearing, I believe it breaks uniform regulations." The guard's face remained blank, his discipline holding strong despite the judge's increasingly harsh tone. A young couple nearby slowed down, becoming the first witnesses to the developing scene. More tourists started to gather at a safe distance, sensing trouble. The atmosphere around the guard post changed from relaxed sightseeing to tense watching. "Perhaps you don't realize who I am," Pembroke continued, his face flushing slightly. "I am Judge Lawrence Pembroke of the Crown Court. I have overseen dozens of cases involving correct procedures and the separation of church and state." He leaned closer. "Your little display isn't just unsuitable, it could be illegal." An elderly man with a veteran's badge pinned to his jacket stepped forward from the growing crowd. "Sir, if I could just suggest—" "You may not," Pembroke cut him off sharply, without looking away from the guard. "This is about a legal principle." He waved the veteran away dismissively, just as he would wave away lawyers overstepping in his courtroom. "This is your last chance to remove that religious symbol voluntarily," Pembroke announced, loud enough now for everyone nearby to hear. "I don't know what made you think you could alter a ceremonial uniform with personal items, but I assure you the rules are very clear." Several tourists began whispering amongst themselves. A woman with an American accent asked loudly enough to be heard, "Is he allowed to talk to the guard like that?" Her friend shrugged, unsure of the rules. "Nothing to say for yourself?" Pembroke pushed, taking the silence as defiance instead of duty. "Very well. Your silence is noted, though it won't help you in court." The mention of court sent fresh whispers through the onlookers. The veteran tried to step in again, moving closer despite being dismissed earlier. "Your Honor, these men have strict orders not to—" "I know their orders perfectly well," Pembroke snapped, "and I also know the regulations about military uniforms, which this man is currently breaking." He turned back to the guard, whose face remained impassive, even though he was the center of a growing public argument. With practiced movements, Judge Pembroke took a business card and a pen from his inside pocket. On the back of the card, he quickly wrote a formal summons, including the date, time, and courtroom number. "You are hereby ordered to appear before me at Westminster Magistrates' Court, 10 a.m. tomorrow," he announced, holding the card up so the guard could see it. When the guard made no move to take it, Pembroke carefully tucked it into the front of the red tunic. "Failure to appear will result in a warrant for your arrest." As Pembroke turned to leave, the crowd moved aside for him, their faces showing a mix of confusion and disapproval. The veteran slowly shook his head, looking both concerned and shocked. But Judge Pembroke walked away with the steady, confident walk of a man certain that justice was on his side. Westminster Magistrates' Court looked serious against the grey London sky the next morning. The usual mix of lawyers and people facing charges filtered through its heavy doors, their faces grim, ready for legal battles. But today, an unusual figure among them made heads turn and conversations stop. Royal Guard James Thornton walked up the courthouse steps, dressed in his full ceremonial uniform. His bright red tunic and tall bearskin hat stood out dramatically against the usual dark suits and robes. His polished boots echoed on the marble floor as he entered the building. Back straight, chin up, eyes forward, just like when he was on duty. Every head turned as he passed. The bright red uniform seemed almost deliberately challenging in this place of black-robed justice. "Is that actually?" a junior lawyer started to say. "A Queen's Guard, yes," his colleague confirmed. "Saw something online this morning. Some judge had a problem with his uniform, apparently." The court clerk almost dropped her pile of papers when Thornton came to the registration desk. "I'm here for a hearing before Judge Pembroke," he stated, his voice clear and precise from military training. What surprised everyone wasn't just his uniform, but what was missing. He had no lawyer with him. "You're representing yourself?" the clerk asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Yes, ma'am," Thornton replied simply. News of the guard's arrival spread quickly through the courthouse. By the time Thornton took his place in courtroom 3, the public gallery was packed. Among the spectators sat 3 elderly men wearing blazers decorated with medals, clearly military veterans, their faces showing worried support. Judge Pembroke entered, his black robes flowing behind him. He looked momentarily surprised by the full gallery before his face settled into its usual judicial blankness. His eyes found Thornton straight away. He noted with satisfaction that the guard had obeyed the summons, but frowned slightly, seeing he had no lawyer. "Guard Thornton," he began, looking at the court list. "I see you've chosen to appear without a lawyer. Given the serious charges, I strongly advise you to reconsider." His tone had the slightly patronizing concern he usually used for defendants making bad choices. "I will represent myself, Your Honor," Thornton replied, his voice carrying easily across the courtroom without seeming loud. Pembroke's eyebrows rose slightly. "Very well, it's your right, though I warn you it might not be wise." He shuffled his papers, a theatrical move meant to show control through familiarity with procedures. "Let the record show that the defendant has declined legal representation despite the court's recommendation." You could feel the tension in the courtroom. The spectators knew they were about to witness an unusual legal fight, a clash between military tradition and judicial power, with a lone guard seemingly defenseless against the full force of the court. Judge Pembroke leaned forward, fingers steepled, ready to start proceedings he was sure would end in a quick, clear lesson. "Let me state the charges clearly," Judge Pembroke began. "Guard Thornton, you are accused of 3 specific offenses. First, deliberately failing to comply with military uniform regulations. Second, showing disrespect to the traditions and protocols of the Queen's Guard by altering a uniform that represents centuries of military history. And third, the inappropriate display of religious symbolism while carrying out official duties as a representative of the Crown." Pembroke lifted a thick law book from his bench. "The legal precedent in these matters is quite clear. In the case of Jameson versus the Metropolitan Police in 2010, the court ruled that officers on duty must remain religiously neutral. Similarly, in Williams versus the Ministry of Defense, the court confirmed that military uniform codes override individual religious expression while personnel are on active duty." In the gallery, one of the veterans shifted uncomfortably. The spectators were completely silent, many leaning forward to hear every word. "I would draw the court's attention to Military Uniform Code Section 47B, Pembroke continued, picking up another document, which clearly states that no unauthorized additions, changes, or personal items shall be visible on ceremonial uniforms during official duties. The wording here is perfectly clear." He put the document down firmly and looked sternly at Thornton. "What we have here is a clear case of an individual putting personal religious beliefs above both military rules and constitutional standards. This court cannot let such disregard for established rules go unchallenged." Pembroke leaned forward, his voice dropping to a quieter tone that still carried throughout the silent courtroom. "I understand that religious belief can be powerful, Guard Thornton. However, when you put on that uniform, you stop being a private individual with personal beliefs. You become a symbol of the state, a state that must stay neutral on religious matters. The penalties in this case are significant. I am prepared to issue a fine of £5,000 for the uniform violation alone, with extra penalties for the other charges. Furthermore, I will recommend to your commanding officer that disciplinary action be taken, possibly including suspension from ceremonial duties." A murmur went through the gallery at how severe the proposed punishment was. One of the veterans half stood up before being gently pulled back down by his friend. "Before we move on to your defense, if you have one," Pembroke concluded, his tone suggesting he didn't expect much, "I want to stress that this court takes no pleasure in disciplining military personnel. However, rules exist for a reason, and no one, regardless of their position or how impressive their uniform is above those rules. The integrity of our institutions depends on consistently enforcing standards." He took off his glasses, deliberately polishing them with a cloth from his pocket, a gesture regular courtroom observers recognized as signaling the end of his argument. "Now then, Guard Thornton, what do you have to say for yourself?" The courtroom held its breath as the figure in the red uniform prepared to speak. Several spectators exchanged doubtful looks, clearly expecting little from a man they assumed had no legal training. Judge Pembroke leaned back, a faint smile playing on his lips, confident the guard's response would only prove him right. Guard Thornton stepped forward with military precision. When he spoke, his voice had the same measured authority as before, but now with an unexpected skill that made Judge Pembroke's eyebrows shoot up. "Your Honor, before I deal with the specific charges, I must correct something for the court record." He stood perfectly straight, hands by his sides. "I stand before you today, not just as Guard James Thornton, but as Captain James Thornton, formerly of the Judge Advocate General's Corps and a qualified barrister licensed to practice law in England and Wales." A wave of whispers rushed through the gallery. Judge Pembroke's hand, reaching for his water glass, stopped in mid-air. "Before my current role with the Queen's Guard, a position I asked for out of respect for tradition and my family's history, I spent 6 years as legal advisor to the 5th Battalion. I have a first-class law degree from Cambridge and was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn." The veterans in the gallery exchanged knowing looks. One allowed a small, satisfied smile to appear on his weathered face. "Now, to address the charges one by one." Thornton turned slightly to face both the judge and the gallery. "First, about the alleged breach of uniform regulations. I refer the court to Military Regulation 15C7, subsection 3. This rule specifically allows service members to wear small, barely visible religious symbols if they represent deeply held faith and don't interfere with duty." From his breast pocket, Thornton produced a small document which he gave to the court clerk. "This is my approved request for religious accommodation, signed by Colonel Hargreaves 3 years ago. You'll see it specifically mentions the cross in question, which belonged to my grandfather who died at Normandy wearing this very symbol." Judge Pembroke took the document, reading it with growing unease, his earlier confidence clearly fading. "Regarding the second charge of disrespecting tradition," Thornton continued smoothly, "tradition itself supports my case. The history of the Queen's Guard includes examples going back to the Great War, where religious symbols were allowed as part of the blood traditions connecting generations of soldiers. As for the legal cases you mentioned," Thornton went on, now fully acting as a barrister, "I must respectfully point out that Your Honor has applied them incorrectly here. The Jameson versus Metropolitan Police case specifically excluded military ceremonial units, as noted in Justice Worthington's supporting opinion, and the Williams versus Ministry of Defense case dealt with political symbols, not religious ones. A difference later rulings have carefully maintained. From the gallery, the oldest veteran nodded firmly, tapping his chest where his own medals hung, likely above a similar symbol hidden beneath his clothes. Thornton produced another document. I've taken the liberty of compiling the relevant case law, including Edwards versus the United Kingdom, from the European Court of Human Rights. This case established that minimal religious expression by uniformed personnel does not mean the state endorses that religion. The document was passed to Pembroke, whose expression had shifted from confident to increasingly worried as his legal arguments were taken apart by the man he had expected to lecture. Furthermore, Thornton continued, I must raise an issue of jurisdiction. Your Honor has proceeded as if this is a matter for civilian courts, when in fact, uniform compliance falls under military authority. The correct place for such a complaint would be the military chain of command, starting with my commanding officer, not Westminster Magistrates' Court. At this, one of the court clerks nodded unconsciously, then quickly corrected herself when Pembroke glanced her way. Even if the jurisdiction were correct, which it isn't, the summons itself was improperly delivered. A handwritten note on a business card doesn't count as proper service under the Courts Act, Section 27. I appeared today out of respect for the court as an institution, not because that note created any legal requirement. Thornton's delivery remained respectful throughout. His tone was never accusing, despite the powerful legal critique he was delivering. This calmness seemed to unsettle Pembroke more than any angry outburst could have. In summary, Your Honor, the charges against me must fail because 1. I have proper authorization for the religious symbol I wear. 2. This authorization fits with both military tradition and regulations. 3. This court does not have jurisdiction over the matter. And 4. Even if points 1 to 3 were invalid, which they are not, the correct legal procedure was not followed in bringing this case. The courtroom was completely silent as Thornton finished his defense. Judge Pembroke stared at the documents in front of him, his judicial certainty visibly collapsing with every second that passed. Pembroke cleared his throat, adjusting his robes in a clear attempt to regain composure. These are interesting arguments, Captain Thornton, he began, his voice lacking its earlier certainty. If I may, Your Honor. A new voice came from the back of the courtroom. Heads turned as a distinguished man in military dress uniform walked down the center aisle. The medals on his chest caught the light, a display of honor that demanded immediate respect. Colonel Richard Hargreaves, commanding officer of the King's Guard. The newcomer announced. I can speak directly to the approval procedure for Captain Thornton's religious accommodation request, if the court allows. After a moment's hesitation, Pembroke nodded. Very well. The court will hear your statement. Colonel Hargreaves stood beside Captain Thornton. The accommodation request mentioned was thoroughly checked at multiple levels of command, following Ministry of Defense Directive 114.7. Captain Thornton's cross meets all the requirements. It is small, unobtrusive, and doesn't interfere with his duties. He produced a leather folder with more documents. I've brought the complete file, including the theological advice and historical review that were part of our approval. Similar allowances have been granted to Sikh, Muslim, and Jewish members of the Guard, in line with our commitment to religious diversity within military discipline. Pembroke took the folder, his judicial mask slipping further. And regarding the jurisdiction question raised by Captain Thornton, that is absolutely correct, Colonel Hargreaves confirmed. Uniform compliance is an internal military matter. Under the Armed Forces Act, civilian courts have no authority in such cases unless there are extraordinary circumstances. Your Honor, Captain Thornton spoke again. Given the evidence and testimony presented, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges on both legal and procedural grounds. Pembroke looked down at his notes, then at the documents, and finally at the two military men standing at attention. The packed gallery waited for his response. "It appears," he admitted reluctantly, "there are significant legal complications with this case that I hadn't fully grasped." In light of the jurisdictional issues raised and the documentation provided, Pembroke continued, choosing his words carefully, "this court must acknowledge that it has overstepped its proper authority in this matter. The charges are dismissed," he concluded, bringing his gavel down much less forcefully than usual. "This court has no further business with Captain Thornton." Pembroke stood up quickly, keen to escape the scene of his judicial error. "Court is adjourned," he announced, already turning towards his private chambers. "Your Honor." Captain Thornton's voice stopped him mid-step. "If I may make one final statement for the record." Pembroke hesitated, then nodded curtly, bracing himself. Captain Thornton stood at attention, his dignity intact. "Yesterday, in front of many witnesses at Buckingham Palace, I was publicly accused of disrespecting military tradition and breaking regulations, accusations now proven false. For the sake of the uniform I wear and the institution I represent, I respectfully request that the court issue a formal statement acknowledging this mistake." Pembroke's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the bench. For a man whose career was built on legal precision and unshakable confidence, this request was more than just procedure. It was a public confrontation with his own bias. After what felt like a very long moment, Pembroke nodded slowly. "You're right, Captain. The court made an incorrect assumption based on personal feelings that have no place in legal proceedings." He straightened up, his judicial dignity returning, but this time serving a different kind of justice. "Let the record show that Captain James Thornton has at all times acted in full compliance with military regulations. His religious accommodation was properly obtained, and his conduct has been exemplary. The court apologizes for the error and any distress it may have caused." "Thank you, Your Honor," Captain Thornton replied. "If I may add one final thought, not as a legal point, but a personal one?" Pembroke hesitated, then nodded. "The symbol I wear means something deeply personal to me, not just my faith, but my connection to my grandfather who died wearing it at Normandy. Yet I understand that symbols can trigger strong feelings in others based on their own experiences. In a diverse society, we must find ways to respect both tradition and difference, to honor both individual expression and shared standards. Finding that balance isn't always easy, but it's worth trying." Judge Pembroke's expression subtly changed. Something new appeared in his eyes, not just professional respect, but a deeper understanding. "Well said, Captain. That is a perspective this court will consider." With a final nod to both military men, Pembroke ended the proceedings. "This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned." His gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to mark not just the end of the hearing, but perhaps the start of a more thoughtful understanding. What does it truly mean to respect tradition while also embracing diversity? Captain Thornton's story shows us that quick judgments often say more about us than about the people we judge. The cross he wore stood for both faith and family history, things Judge Pembroke didn't consider in his rush to judgment. In a world where we often make assumptions based on how things look, perhaps this story is a valuable reminder. Behind every uniform, every robe, every symbol we see, there's a human story worth understanding before we decide what we think. If this story made you think, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the Royal Guards, who stand as living symbols of duty and tradition. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.